1 in the morning. That's when it hit. Not because timing is ever random with earthquakes, it isn't, faults don't check the clock, but because that detail explains almost everything about why this particular magnitude, 5. 2 produced the outcome it did, people asleep, unable to react. In a region that had already been shaking quietly for hours before this one made headlines, this wasn't a bolt from nowhere. It was the loudest entry so far in a sequence that's still being written. Let's take it apart properly. The core facts first, cleanly stated. At 1:04 a.m. local time, an earthquake struck the Granada metropolitan area in Andalusia, southern Spain, with an epicenter located near the town of Alhendín. Spain's Instituto Geográfico Nacional initially assigned a magnitude of 5. That estimate was subsequently revised upward to 5. 2, as additional station data was incorporated, a routine and expected refinement in the hours following any moderate seismic event. Depth was shallow, on the order of just a few kilometers. The shaking was felt across a strikingly wide geographic footprint, throughout Andalusia, into Castilla-La Mancha, and as far as Madrid. Andalusia's 112 emergency line logged more than 80 calls in the immediate aftermath. Reported impacts included falling debris, damaged building facades and roofs, concentrated notably in the municipality of Armilla, and at least one case of debris striking a parked vehicle. No fatalities or injuries have been reported. The regional seismic emergency protocol was activated. That's the headline event. But the headline event is not the full dataset, and treating it as an isolated occurrence is precisely the analytical error this piece is going to avoid. Let's establish the sequence, because sequence is everything in seismology, and this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint rather than just a news item. In the hours preceding the 5.2, the same general area had already produced a magnitude 3, 7 earthquake. Following the main event, activity continued, a magnitude 3. 3 and a magnitude 3. 0 later the same day, a magnitude 3. 1 roughly 2 days out, and critically, a magnitude 4. 8 earthquakes striking essentially the same epicentral location several days later. Laid end to end, this is not a main shock followed by a conventional monotonically decaying aftershock tail. This is a swarm. The distinction matters, and it's worth being precise about it. A classical main shock aftershock sequence follows a well-characterized statistical pattern, Omori's law, where aftershock frequency decreases roughly as an inverse function of time since the largest event, and where that largest event is unambiguously identifiable as the primary stress release episode. A swarm behaves differently. Multiple earthquakes of broadly comparable magnitude, clustered tightly in space and time without one event clearly dominating the sequence, and without the same predictable decay signature. The fact that a 4.8 struck days after the 5. 2, in nearly the same location, rather than a monotonically smaller event, is itself diagnostic. It's evidence against a simple main shock aftershock model, and evidence for an ongoing, more complex process of stress redistribution across a fault network that hasn't yet fully released. This is not new behavior for this specific region. Granada has a documented recent precedent for exactly this kind of extended swarm. A sequence beginning in December of a prior year that ultimately produced hundreds of shallow earthquakes over a period of roughly 2 months, several strong enough to be felt widely and to cause minor structural damage, prompting public reassurance messaging at the national level. Spanish seismic authorities characterized that kind of activity as consistent with, in their words, common behavior for this specific region, not an anomaly, but a recognized mode of seismic release particular to this part of the Iberian Peninsula. Understanding why requires zooming out to the tectonic setting, because Granada's seismicity isn't produced by a single, clean, well-behaved fault, the way some famous seismic zones are. This region sits within the Betic Cordillera, a mountain belt formed by the ongoing slow-motion convergence between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. That convergence isn't accommodated by one discrete boundary fault. It's distributed across a genuinely complex network of smaller faults throughout southern Spain, a structural style that geologists sometimes describe as diffuse deformation. This structural complexity has a direct consequence for seismicity. Rather than producing occasional large, well-isolated ruptures along a single well-mapped fault, this kind of setting tends to produce exactly the pattern we're watching now. Clusters and swarms, moderate magnitudes, multiple faults, potentially interacting and transferring stress to one another, with less of the clean, singular rupture signature seen in simpler tectonic settings. It's also worth noting, for context on this region's seismic range, that Granada's broader area has hosted genuinely deep, unusual seismicity historically, including a very large intermediate to deep focus earthquake decades ago, sourced hundreds of kilometers beneath the surface, a signature associated with subducted or foundering lithospheric material beneath this part of the Mediterranean. That event is a different category of seismicity entirely from what's occurring now. This current swarm is shallow, crustal, and structurally tied to near-surface fault systems, but its existence underscores that the tectonics beneath this region are genuinely three-dimensionally complex, operating across multiple depth regimes simultaneously. The seismicity we're discussing today belongs to the shallow crustal category, the category directly responsible for the strong surface shaking, the felt reports across multiple provinces, and the structural damage reported in Armilla and surrounding municipalities. Now, let's talk about why the shallow depth specifically amplified the surface impact here, because it's central to understanding the damage reports. Seismic energy attenuates, loses intensity as it propagates through rock. A shallow focus earthquake has dramatically less material to travel through before reaching the surface directly above it, meaning the same magnitude produces measurably stronger peak ground acceleration near the epicenter compared to an equivalent deeper event. This is standard seismological attenuation behavior, and it's precisely why a moderate 5.2, not in absolute terms, an exceptionally large earthquake, was nonetheless capable of producing the kind of localized structural damage reported. Cracked facades, dislodged roofing material, falling debris striking a parked vehicle. The magnitude tells you the energy released at the source. The depth, combined with local site conditions, tells you what actually happens at the surface. Now let's address the analytical question that matters most going forward. What does this swarm's continuation, with a 4 rear? 8 following the 5. 2 by several days, rather than a clean decay, actually imply about near-term hazard. The honest, rigorous position is this. Earthquake swarms, including ones that produce a moderate main shock in the 5 magnitude range, statistically do not typically escalate into significantly larger events. The base rate for that outcome, drawn from the global catalog of similar swarm sequences, is low. However, low probability is not zero probability, and it is a documented feature of some historical swarm sequences worldwide that a moderate event partway through the sequence is later followed by an even larger one, rather than the sequence simply tapering. Distinguishing in real time which category a given ongoing swarm belongs to, genuinely still ongoing, has this swarm already peaked, would be found through continued seismic monitoring of a few key indicators. First, are subsequent events showing any spatial migration, moving along strike of a mapped fault or jumping to adjacent, previously quiet structures, which would indicate stress actively propagating through the broader fault network rather than simply relaxing on the original rupture surface. Second, is the overall rate of M3 plus events per day trending down, consistent with a statistically expected decay, or is it holding steady or increasing, which would argue against a simple tapering interpretation? Third, are any of Spain's continuous GPS geodetic networks in the region detecting measurable surface displacement associated with this sequence, actual permanent ground deformation as opposed to transient shaking, which would indicate the underlying fault system is undergoing more significant slip than the earthquake magnitudes alone might suggest? These are precisely the metrics Spain's Instituto Geográfico Nacional and affiliated seismic monitoring networks will be tracking in the days ahead, and they are the metrics that will ultimately determine whether this sequence is best characterized, in retrospect, as a swarm that peaked with the 5, 2, and 4, 8, and gradually subsided, or as an ongoing process still working through a larger reservoir of accumulated tectonic stress. There's a broader point worth making here about risk communication and regional seismic culture, because it's directly relevant to how a population should reasonably respond to a sequence like this. Andalusia, and Granada specifically, sits within one of the most seismically monitored and best characterized regions of the Iberian Peninsula precisely because of this recurring pattern of swarm activity. The region's seismic emergency protocol, activated within hours of this event, exists as a direct institutional response to this well-understood hazard profile. Rapid building inspection triage, public communication channels, and a monitoring infrastructure built for exactly this kind of clustered, moderate magnitude sequence, rather than a rare, singular catastrophic event. That institutional readiness is itself a data point. This is a known, recurring hazard mode for this specific geography, not a novel or unprecedented crisis, and the regional response reflects calibrated experience rather than improvisation. What should genuinely inform public behavior in the days ahead is not reassurance that the sequence is definitely over, nor alarm that a larger earthquake is imminent. The data doesn't currently support either strong claim. What it supports is continued, active monitoring, structural caution around any buildings with visible damage from the initial 5. 2, given that subsequent moderate shaking could exploit that pre-existing weakness, and calibrated attention to official updates from Spain's seismic monitoring authorities, rather than either dismissing the sequence or catastrophizing it. To close the analytical loop, This event is best understood not as a discrete earthquake, but as the most prominent data point so far in an active, multi-day seismic swarm occurring within a structurally complex segment of the Betic tectonic system, a system with clear, recent historical precedent for producing exactly this kind of extended, clustered activity. The shallow depth explains the disproportionate surface impact relative to the magnitude. The subsequent 4, 8, arriving days later rather than as part of a clean decay, is the single most important data point arguing that this sequence should be treated as ongoing rather than concluded, and the determining question, whether this swarm has effectively run its course or represents the early phase of a longer, more significant release of accumulated stress, remains open, pending the seismic and geodetic data still being gathered in real time by the networks monitoring this region as closely as any seismic zone in Western Europe.